It's fair to say that most of us had a childhood fear of the bogeyman. But for the people of Sacramento, that fear became a reality. In the span of just 1 month between December 1978 and January 1979, a serial killer murdered 6 people in the Californian city. These killings would soon become notorious for the shocking carnage left at the crime scenes. In a time when communities felt safe and people left their doors unlocked, for the Vampire of Sacramento, it was an open invitation. Yes, today I'm going to be covering the case that lots of you have asked me for, that of Richard Trenton Chase, otherwise known as the Vampire of Sacramento. I cover this guy on my Serial Killer Next Door tour. For any of you in the UK who fancy coming and seeing me in my theatre tour, please do. Somebody said in a review, it is equally entertaining as it is terrifying. So this man is somebody that is familiar to me. But doing the deep dive research around this particular serial killer introduced me to a whole heap of new information that has the power and potential to turn my stomach. I will also warn you that the sarcasm will be ramped up today just because of some of the things that I've found out. For all of you who are new to this channel, I release my content on a Wednesday and a Sunday, so if you're interested in crime content and you like a bit of consistency, I like to know when my true crime videos are gonna be popping up, get your notifications on, because I'll be there, same time, same place, every single week, without fail. It is my promise. As ever, before I start the video, big shout out to all of my Patreon and YouTube membership subs. You're making a huge difference to the content that I can create, so thank you massively. Right, let's get into this. Richard Trenton Chase, name that is synonymous with the term serial killer. Known as the Vampire of Sacramento, his crimes in the 1970s became utterly notorious, and he is likely, when I think about examples of a disorganized killer, the perfect example, but we'll talk about that more later down the line. So Chase was born on the 23rd of May 1950, and he was born in Santa Clara, California. His childhood was miserable, really miserable, dire, very abusive. His parents were strict disciplinarians. His father was also a really heavy drinker, and he would frequently beat Richard and his younger sister as well. So there was a very high level of volatility within the household, and also dependency issues in the household, which are all foundational issues that we can certainly see contribute to certain problems that can be developed later on down the line where children have been exposed to these kind of concerns in the household. Also, the parents had a really volatile relationship, so there was a lot of violence. They had frequent, very violent arguments, and one of the constants was that Richard Chase's mother would accuse her husband of being unfaithful, but also trying to poison her. I think that's an important link just for some of the developments that occurs in Richard's perception of the world down the line. And it goes without saying, if you're being brought up in this kind of chaotic, dysfunctional household, you are going to suffer as a result. And at this point, we can certainly look at Richard Chase and his sister as being the victims. Also, it's notable that Chase suffered with mental illness pretty much for the majority of his life. But even though there were some clear red flags in his childhood regarding his mental instability, he never received any professional support and intervention at that point in his life. And this undoubtedly contributed to him spending the rest of his life being the victim of his delusions. And in turn, this would lead to him taking his own victims. By the age of 10, Chase showed some clear traits that are deeply concerning. And we can even find the McDonald triad in his behaviour. So animal torture, fire starting, and bedwetting. As a child, wow, we're going to go on a journey where animal torture is concerned. So buckle in. Like a lot of you, I'm a massive animal lover. and it pains me when I hear about these things. And Richard Chase has a pretty high up level when it comes down to this kind of torture. So he was known in particular to kill neighborhood cats. And that's right, his neighbor's cats. I am not sure that if you lived in my neighborhood and were discovered to be guilty of killing our cats, that you would not experience an old-fashioned lynching. Genuinely. But that didn't happen to Richard. But demonstrates really early on that he enjoys the torture of animals. He also exhibited a real obsession with fire. So he was noted to start several small fires. And he was also a compulsive bedwetter. These three indicators are believed to be precursors to violent behaviour in adulthood, and accordingly they are things that you would expect to see in your typical serial killer. That noted, some of the elements that I've talked about of the MacDonald triad, particularly bedwetting, they're symptomatic of childhood abuse, and it seems that Chase certainly suffered childhood abuse, and it feels as if the early childhood served as creating this ingredients list of the perfect storm that inevitably would create, as far as society was concerned, a monster. Chase attended Mira Loma High School in Sacramento, and he graduated in 1968. And when I read about the relationships he had with his peers, they did note that he was somebody who kept himself to himself. He was quiet, he was relatively withdrawn, but he wasn't somebody who was violent. They didn't remember him as a bully. They didn't remember him as an individual who stood out because he caused problems at school. He didn't. But what they did start to see was in his final years of high school, his behaviour became stranger. And those peers who were in his classes said that they at this point believed that it was probably to do with the fact that he was taking drugs. So they could see that his behaviour wasn't typical at this point, but they probably had experience of seeing friends on drugs and could see that his behaviour was relatable to that. And it turned out their suspicions were absolutely true. During his teenage years, Chase did become a really heavy drug dependent. He also became an alcoholic like his father, and he became very erratic in his behaviour. So even though at school, certainly as we move into his later teenage years, he declines and he is getting involved in petty crime, no doubt to fund his drug habit, and he doesn't come from a position of wealth familially, so arguably he's going to need to find an income source, and stealing things and other, shall we say, less pro-social forms of behaviour may provide such a financial income stream. But we're also now adding criminality to his cooking pot of potential, aren't we? We could certainly say that this behaviour is becoming more and more concerning, and one would hope that if people around him notice this kind of behaviour, they too would be concerned. We'll come on to that a little bit more later. Now, according to the girls that he dated, because obviously he's a young man of a certain age, he's going to be trying to engage in relationships no matter what his mental state is. It's part and parcel of the human psyche and condition. The problem that the girls said he experienced, and this was consistent with all the girls that he dated, was that he could not keep an erection during sex. He just was not aroused by regular sex, and down the line we'd realise why, because he didn't want a consenting, breathing sexual partner. It simply wasn't in his repertoire of what turned him on sexually. Now, Chase obviously had concerns about how he felt, maybe about his behaviour, but it was enough to consult a psychiatrist. So clearly, at this moment in time, when he's seeking that professional help, he's wanting answers. And it's pivotal for me that he goes and sees a psychiatrist, because this is at the moment where potentially he could have been saved. This is where intervention can occur. And he goes and talks to this psychiatrist about the fact that he's also impotent during having sex with the women that he's trying at least to have sex with. And the psychiatrist decided to suggest a reason for this impotence as being repressed anger. So basically gives him a reasoning behind why he can't ejaculate with a girl that he's having sex with and why he can't keep a hard on. And arguably, this could make sense to Richard Chase. He's had a pretty difficult childhood. I'm sure he did feel very angry. Children who are horribly abused feel powerless and helpless. But whatever went on in that session, it's not as if Chase gained enough to feel that he wanted to return. So even though he was potentially offered some other treatment options, he didn't pursue any of them. So even though he turned up for that session and he actually wanted that session, he mustn't have felt satisfied. Or indeed, maybe he walked away thinking, well, I've got all this repressed anger. Maybe I just need to find a place to direct it. Who knows? At the age of 18, Chase leaves his parents' home. According to some people and some reports, they say that the reason for this is he was kicked out. Wouldn't surprise me. Massive level of dysfunction in that household, lots of violence. I'm sure that the relationships were not strong, and that meant that they didn't have an issue with kicking out their mentally unwell son. But clearly, if you're already struggling with dependency, dealing with mental health issues, have massive instability in your psyche, and your behaviour is outlandishly dreadful, you probably don't need, added to that, potentially being homeless or feeling that the very limited support that you have is now non-existent. And his mental health just declines. Obviously, he's not in his parents' home, so drink and drugs now become something that he doesn't need to hide. And he has a particular like for psychotropic drugs, which are not helpful if you are dealing with delusional state of mind. As he gets a little bit older, he develops hypochondria. So he was absolutely convinced that he was seriously physically ill. And guys, when I say he was convinced he was seriously physically ill, I appreciate people have health anxiety. They genuinely believe, for example, that they've got cancer, and they haven't, but they can't shake that. And it makes them feel seriously unhappy and seriously unwell at times. But you can see that they're at least within that anxiety. It's a level of ration. People do die of cancer. Maybe you've been affected by people in your life dying of cancer. Maybe you are so protective of your children that the worst thing that you could imagine is leaving them because you die of cancer. And so it manifests as this health anxiety. But what we're talking about with Richard Chase is that the illnesses and the concerns that he had about his body do not register in reality. So he gets convinced he's seriously physically ill, but what we actually note is that it's his mental health that really he should have been concerned with. So he goes to live in an apartment with some friends, and I'm putting friends in inverted commas, and you'll understand why, because I'm not convinced that Richard Chase actually had any alliances, genuinely. And from the moment that he actually moved in, things started to fall apart. Because the thing about Richard Chase is he wasn't exactly the ideal housemate. Firstly, his behaviour was really erratic. Some would even suggest bizarre. And there are a few reasons why his behaviour was concerning to his housemates. First of all, he had a habit of walking around the apartment naked. Now, I know there are some people out there who are like, what's the problem, Emma? What's the problem? Nothing wrong with being naked. It's like, well, you might be cool with that, but if you're living with housemates who just do not want to see what you got hanging out, it could cause a few problems. He really didn't care who was there. If there were visitors, Richard Chase would just be like, hey, I'm just going to walk through the kitchen, stark bollock naked. These are obviously going to cause problems around the actual experience of living there. And he was also frequently off his face on drugs. So imagine a naked, high, tripping Richard Chase wandering around your house whilst you're, I don't know, trying to revise or hang out with mates or just seem like a normal functioning human. It seems like at this point he was particularly under the influence of LSD, marijuana and alcohol. These would have been a really heavy combination, particularly when he was struggling and potentially trying to self-medicate his mental unwellness. So ultimately, he gets asked to move out, which does not surprise me. But Richard is like, why would I move out? And they're like, 'Cause you keep wandering around naked, high on drugs, scaring us. He's like, it's your problem. So he just refuses. Like, you guys are the issue here. So literally everyone else moves out instead. Now, it makes perfect sense that this would occur. No one wants to live in a situation like that. Well, I suppose some people might, but not the typical kind of person. But this means that he's alone. And another additional stressor to individuals like Richard Chase dealing with what they're dealing with is being isolated. And his condition worsens again. Then he goes through a string of housemates because people need somewhere to live, and sometimes you're desperate, and the naked high guy seems like a better option than being on the streets. I can imagine that that's literally the only time you'd make that choice. But when they moved in, they couldn't tolerate his behaviour, and he was really unpleasant to them as well. And he can't sustain living independently because he can't afford to pay for an entire home that's meant to have roomlets. So the consequence of this is he's ultimately forced to move back in with his mother. She had at least divorced Chase's father in 1972, so there wasn't necessarily the same level of chaos in the home at that moment in time, and certainly she would be a safer person to be around than to be alone in a place where you're constantly high on drugs, losing your mind. But Richard Chase's mental state further declines, and he becomes even more convinced that he is really seriously ill. So he believes that his heart has stopped beating. Yes, you are right. That would mean he was dead. He isn't dead. The fact that he's thinking that his heart stopped beating whilst he's considering the potential means that it hasn't. But this is how terrible his anxiety around health was, and also how irrational it is. He also thought he was a walking corpse. I will be honest with you, there are pictures of Richard Chase where I feel like, he does have a point, that he just kind of look a little bit like a walking corpse. But I think that was more to do with the way he lived as opposed to him being a walking corpse. Also, he decided that he had somebody come in and steal his pulmonary artery. He thought his skull had been broken into pieces, and he was actually convinced that these pieces of his skull were shifting beneath his skin. So he thought, well, I know how to deal with that. I need to check where those pesky little pieces of skull are going. So he shaved all his hair off because he wanted to track the movement of his cranial bones. And it seems ridiculous to be able to state this and to imagine this man was living and experiencing this in our society without people just running in and trying to rescue him from himself. Because what we see clearly is evidence of paranoid delusions. Absolute paranoia, absolute delusional belief systems, but it's real for him. So for Richard Chase, these feelings must have been absolutely terrifying. I mean, imagine thinking that somebody had stolen parts of your body, or that your heart had stopped beating, or that your skull was shifting around, and genuinely doing things to try to track these issues. That demonstrates that even though to us it seems absolutely ludicrous, to him it was real. Also, he starts to get convinced that his mother's trying to poison him, which is interesting because we track back to the fact that his mother used to accuse her then husband of trying to poison her. So he's picked up on that phobia, hasn't he? So this means in the end he moves back into an apartment by himself, and this apartment is paid for by his father. This is at the point where he gets diagnosed as a possible paranoid schizophrenic by a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist said that he said possible paranoid schizophrenic because he felt it was quite difficult to be absolute in that definition and classification, because he said that the amount of drugs that Richard Chase was taking made that it was really difficult for him during observation to know whether it was the drugs he was reacting to or the mental illness. So he was admitted to a hospital for 72 hours. And when the doctors observed him, they actually said that they felt he needed to stay longer. It was a recommendation. It wasn't that he was told you can't leave. So he was given the option to leave and he decides to. So Chase discharges himself. Bear in mind at this point, this is a man who is so obsessed with his health that he's trying anything and everything to remedy his ills. So a good example is he tries to absorb vitamin C directly into his brain. And the way he does this is like, I could buy those tablets that you get in various health stores, lots of different choices. Just take a few of them, see how it goes. Or I could take a whole orange and I could press it to my forehead. And by thus pressing the orange to my forehead, I shall, by osmosis no doubt, absorb the nutrients via diffusion. That's what he did. I doubt that he found it worked very effectively, but you got to try these things, guys, haven't you? Also, he became absolutely convinced that his heart was shrinking. He believed that the Nazis were also turning his blood to powder. And he believed that they'd actually planted poison beneath his soap dish. Now, interestingly, Chase had this belief, even though it's completely false, that he was Jewish. And he also thought that he had a Star of David on his forehead, which was why the Nazis were persecuting him. And he also believed that the fact that the blood was being turned to powder meant that the only way that he could sort that out was to consume blood himself. He believed that if he didn't counter this attack on his body by consuming blood, then his heart would disappear and he would die. It's bizarre when you think that what I've just spoken to you about is how a human being was actually feeling. Now, everything that Richard Chase does is inexcusable, guys, without a doubt. The actual actions, intolerable, disgusting, despicable, absolutely inhumane, without a doubt. But at the same moment in time, we do have to acknowledge what must have been going on for this man. Because it sounds like torture, doesn't it? Believing this stuff and actually starting to have these delusions about how to resolve the issues. Also, clearly doesn't believe in the medical model because he's seen a psychiatrist, he's also had access to hospitals, and yet he's choosing to do things like shove an orange against his forehead, imagining that somehow that's gonna mean that he absorbs the vitamin C. So he must have a belief that the people who are meant to be able to help him probably can't. So we're seeing that his mental state is really declining. And another thing that starts to up during this time of decline is the animal abuse. And wow, he's a high-level killer of animals. It's terrifying. He killed small animals because, believing that his blood's going to be turned to powder, he has to replenish his blood supplies. So he kills these little animals and just eats them raw. He would kill and then gut rabbits. And then he would blend the internal organs with Coca-Cola, the drink of choice. Genuinely, I cannot imagine where the thought of, I've just gutted these rabbits, got the internal organs out, just gonna digest them personally, probably just gonna add some Coca-Cola to it. But this is what he did, believe that this would stop his heart shrinking. Now, I have a bit of an issue because the neighbours literally used to witness Richard Chase taking the neighbourhood pets into his apartment, and then those pets would never be seen again. Is it just me? Genuinely? If somebody said to me, do you know what, Em, I've just seen one of your dogs being taken into Richard Chase's apartment. Richard Chase? You mean the guy who looks like a walking corpse? That guy? You mean the guy who I've heard does despicable things to animals? Yeah, that guy. You let him take my dog into the apartment? I mean, literally, it would not work out for the neighbour who told me, as well as Richard Chase. But this is what's occurring. People are noticing this. I appreciate the sign of the times. We're a lot more likely these days to not let these kind of things go without challenge. People didn't like to cause issues back in the 50s, 60s, but this is ludicrous. And on one occasion, he even, as in the man killing the animals, called a neighbour in to explain the utterly horrific things that he had done to the neighbour's dog. I mean, who would be able to stand in front of Richard Chase and hear him describe the pain that he'd inflicted on your animal and ever walk out of that apartment without immediately being arrested? But this again shows the decline, and he just doesn't have the conscious understanding of reality or the impact of what he's doing. We get to the age of 25. He kills a rabbit, and he actually tries to inject the rabbit's blood into his blood. Just going to throw it out there, you don't need to be a medic to understand the disastrous impact that that would have, injecting of foreign blood into your own blood, and it makes him really, really seriously ill. It gives him blood poisoning, and it's at this point when they're treating him for the blood poisoning, which could have killed him, that they identify him as a danger to himself. So at this point, thank God, he gets involuntary admitted to Beverly Manor. So he doesn't have a choice in this point. In the UK, that would be called a section, where they say, you are a danger to yourself or other people, and we are not going to allow you the option for freedom until we feel that you are safe to walk our streets again. So Beverly Manor was a psychiatric hospital, and it's here that they do diagnose him with severe paranoid schizophrenia. And they also note, whilst he's being treated there, that this hypochondria continues, this obsession with his health. So at Beverly Manor, he does actually receive things like therapy, which is really important. And during his therapy, he starts talking about this obsession that he has of killing small animals and drinking their blood. And he's got this, as we know, obsession with his health, and it's not left him. Doctors think he's making it up. They're like, this guy coming into therapy, telling me he's drinking the blood of small animals. This guy's a joker. He's a joke. He is a joke. Is he a joker? Can you tell me he's a joker? He's a joker. And that's what they obviously think is just fabricating this situation. I'm not saying they thought he was a joker. I'm just saying they didn't think he was telling the truth. So this initial disbelief disappears when, on an occasion, they find Richard Chase in his room with his mouth covered in blood. They also find 2 dead birds on the windowsill, and their necks have been broken, and he's ingested their blood. I have so many questions about that moment. For example, birds are really quick. How on earth did he get the birds? Did he manage to coax them in over a period of time and gain their trust? I cannot get my head around how he managed to get not 1, but 2 birds. Maybe he did just get them in the window and close it using bread or something. I don't know, but I find it really strange. It's like, how on earth does anybody manage that? He also, in that hospital, managed to steal syringes, and he extracted the blood from the therapy dogs. So it's not a surprise, probably not the most professional thing, but he starts to get known in that hospital by the nickname Dracula, and that's the staff and the patients who think that. Another thing that's intriguing and concerning when you think about the mental state of Richard Chase is that he fails to respond to antipsychotic meds. And it's one of those scenarios where a lot of people are like, well, if you've got psychosis, surely antipsychotics are going to be the answer. No, in lots of cases, they don't have an impact. In fact, in many cases, they can make it even worse for the person. So it's not a one-size-fits-all treatment program when it comes down to medication. So the doctors note that he isn't responding, and they believe that the root of the reasoning behind him failing to respond is that he's been using these heavy drugs for so many years. But arguably, one could say that maybe the reason he's acting out in this way is because of deep-rooted trauma that has totally changed his perception of reality, and what he needed was intensive therapy, because the medical model, as far as medication is concerned, doesn't work for everyone. But certainly, this is a guy who since early adolescence has been using hallucinogenics and lots of different drugs to deal with his mental health or to stop some of his emotional pain, and without a doubt, it's going to have had a massive impact. Bear in mind that your brain does not stop developing until you're 25 years of age, and anything that you can use to impact on the problems with that development can lead to certain consequences, and it seems like Richard Chase may be an example of that. So he stays at that institution for a year. That's a long time. And I will say at one point he manages to escape and he goes to his mum's, but he's apprehended and is returned to hospital. A member of staff who worked at that very facility that Richard Chase was in at the time that Richard Chase was an inpatient said that there was a massive problem with it because there was little or no security at the facility. Also, the surrounding wall that one would imagine would be there to protect both the inpatients and, of course, those living in the community was basically really low. So the patients would frequently leave at night and then return in the early morning. And Richard Chase was one of these. I mean, can you imagine what was going on at that moment in time? That they're like, we have these like really unwell individuals. Some of them are being treated for forensically disturbing issues. And one would imagine that it's really important for their safety, but also, you know, let's just throw it out there for the safety of people living in the area, that they just don't get to carte blanche, walk out. You know, for example, we nickname one of them Vampire because he's just going around killing animals, drinking the blood, taking blood from dogs, doing a whole heap of things that could just throw it out, they could be construed as a little bit antisocial. But no, apparently not. Just gets to go off, come back in the morning. You know, the idea of how many small animals met their doom at the hands of Richard Chase is unimaginable during those periods. So as I've said, Chase is in this institution for just over a year, and at this point he's 27. They believe he's no longer a threat to society. But how they came to that conclusion, I have no idea, because of some of the things that he'd engaged in during his time there. And also, this is a guy who's escaping at night and coming back in the early hours. So they don't really have a check on how he's changed or if he's changed per se. And it's going to become clear as I tell this story, and for those of you who know this case already, he was far from rehabilitated. So he returns to his mother's home, and she's like, okay, Richard has been away for over a year. We have seen disturbing patterns within his behaviour throughout his life, and I mean really disturbing. And now he has been rehabilitated according to the psychiatrist in the institution where he was kept because he was so unstable, and they've sent him out with these medications to keep him well. And she's like, so what I should do as the mother is wean him off all his meds. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to wean him off all of his meds. She decided, no, you know what? He doesn't need any antipsychotic medication. What he needs is to just be natural, get rid of it all, accept that there's nothing wrong with him, and move on. Yeah. I don't know whether she'd read an article or who knows, done a weekend course in something, but she's suddenly more qualified than every single practitioner that has had anything to do with Richard Chase. And the problem here is we all have our own ideas around treatment programs and what works and what doesn't work. But certainly, if your son goes into hospital as an inpatient in such an unstable state that he's a danger to himself and others, and then he comes out apparently not, no matter what your feelings, you should stay away from anything to do with his treatment. So after removing him off all his treatment, she then moves him by himself into an apartment. That's right, it appears that she had recently read the Recipe for Disaster manual. So Chase's condition, we know in the past, it's always deteriorated when he's alone, when he's isolated. But now this is going to be further aggravated because he's not on any medication. And we have seen in the past how his actions unravel anyway. let alone after a period of time where potentially he had been in a mental state that was functioning to a level, and all of a sudden that's falling apart, because that's a terrifying experience too. So we see a same pattern as before. Even though he's been in an apartment, he has roommates that come who just cannot tolerate his behaviour. They all move out. He's again alone. We see the decline in his mental health, and he stops looking after himself. His appearance deteriorates. He stops bathing. He stops grooming. He stops brushing his teeth. He even stops eating. Really does lose weight. I mean, you can see by the pictures, he just looks terrible. Continues to kill animals. And it feels as if his mother is in absolute denial about his condition. I appreciate that in the 70s, we were not in a place where people understood mental instability, mental illness per se, in the way that we do today. And it could be very isolating and stigmatizing if you struggled with your mental health in those years, particularly because family members would deny that there was a problem, just didn't want to take it on because they felt a level of shame about it, because they didn't understand it. So she really cannot comprehend that Richard Chase is ill. And this goes as far as to demonstrate. On one occasion, in 1977, Richard Chase arrives on his mother's doorstep and he's holding a dead cat. He then proceeds to eviscerate it in front of her, smears himself with blood and entrails whilst screaming. One could say it was a subtle cry for help. Mother is like, is that just Richard with another neighbourhood cat covered in entrails? She just closes the door. Just like, I'm not dealing with this. I mean, I can't comprehend, or even imagine a scene where your child is screaming, smearing themselves in blood and entrails, and you would just abandon them. But that's what she does. She's like, I can't see it, it's not happening. But at this point, what's even more worrying is that in spite of this clearly deranged behaviour, he starts buying guns. And apparently he practiced shooting obsessively. The 2nd of December 1977, he buys a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. That's not terrifying at all, is it? Now, along with his obsession with guns at this point, he also becomes obsessed with the Hillside Strangler case. Ironically, there actually turned out to be 2 Hillside Stranglers. It was 2 cousins working together, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Bueno Jr. And they happened to be active at the same time as Richard Chase, which was in the late 1970s. And also, it was only for a short period. So, like Chase, they kidnapped, sexually assaulted, raped and strangled to death at least 10 women, and that was just over 4 months. That was between October 1977 and February 1978. He, as far as Chase was concerned, believed that the Hillside Stranglers and him were actually victims of the same Nazi UFO conspiracy. So he feels that he relates to these sick individuals. But again, it doesn't bode well, does it, for the way he's thinking? Now, Chase does end up on the Nevada police radar on the 3rd of August 1977. The reason is officers discovered his Ford Ranchero, and it was lodged in a sand drift near Pyramid Lake, Nevada. They found 2 rifles and a pile of clothes inside, but also, when they're doing that little search, they found a bucket of blood with a liver inside it. Yeah, just as you would, back of the car. I mean, if I'm not driving around with a bucket full of blood with a few internal organs in there, I don't know what I'm doing. It's not a normal Monday for me. Anyway, the police at this point are really suspicious because they're like, this is not normal. And they actually later locate Chase because he's not present with the car. When they find him, he is apparently naked, covered in blood, screaming in the sand. One can only imagine what was going through the officers' minds when they discovered a naked Chase doing that. They then question him, and he actually suggests that the blood is his own, and he tells them that the reason it's in the bucket is because it's leaked through his skin. They go and analyse the organs, of course they do, and they find out it's not his at all, it's a cow's blood and organs. Despite the fact that the police are really concerned at this point, the police didn't have a reason to hold him. I don't know why. Personally, I'd be like, let's just send him to a very high, secure mental health facility, because he's carrying around organs in the back of his car and suggesting he's bleeding from his skin, even though he isn't. And we found him naked, screaming, covered in blood. At that point, I don't think you need to charge them. I think you need to help them. So they end up releasing Chase. I don't get why no intervention occurred at that point. We know he's already been institutionalized, and as I said, the way he was found was terrifying, and he even had weapons in the car. Surely somebody's going to be like, do we have any alarm bells ringing? Because if we don't, I need to find a large alarm and start ringing it. Genuinely, this is all real, guys. So if it couldn't get any worse, in spite of the fact that Chase's mental health is in a disastrous place, it actually continues to deteriorate. We're talking about a ticking time bomb. And a neighbour of his would later describe Chase as really never looking clean looking. He had this really long hair and beard, but then suddenly he cuts his hair shorter. He also shaves most of his beard off. And it's as if he starts to just clean himself up a great deal compared to how he had been prior to this. And there's a bit of me that thinks, okay, we know that he's declining to a position where he's going to kill. But if you're going to do that, you're not going to want to stand out. You're not going to be the person who wants to be immediately identifiable. So could it be that this is a prepping for his actions, that he's preparing for something that he's been building up to? You know, a change in appearance, which is an attempt to disguise himself? Or was it just a consequence of his mental state at the time, because he could have just had a moment of improving in mental health and realised that he needed self-care? Either way, the consequences of his actions I'm going to talk about now are just beyond terrifying. 29th of December 1977. This mental state of Richard Chase is in free fall. He's isolated, his medication isn't being used, his mother also hadn't allowed him to return home from Christmas, so his support has just completely dissipated. And it feels as if these stresses together culminate in Chase's first act of murder. And it's an opportunistic killing. 51-year-old engineer and father of two, Ambrose Griffin, all he's doing is helping his wife bring the groceries in after a shopping trip. Chase drives by, randomly fires 2 shots, going in his direction. That's with the .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. 1 shot missed, the other hit him in the chest. Ambrose's wife, who's just doing a normal day-to-day chore, suddenly sees her husband fall to the ground. She can't believe it. This comes from nowhere. The community is blindsided. This is a completely senseless, random killing of a man that has no history or reasoning in that history to alert anyone to the belief that somebody would want him dead. But even though this is horrific, the fact that this man has been senselessly, needlessly killed in this way in front of his wife, this is just a warm-up for what's going to come. Now, several witnesses, they gave descriptions of the man that they saw fleeing the scene that day after the shooting, but no arrests were made. So there were these vague descriptions, and it felt like when the police looked at this, they had so little to go on. It was just a random, senseless killing. Ambrose had been a victim of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, as I said at the very beginning, one of the things about Richard Chase is he's a disorganised offender. When we talk about disorganised serial killers, often there's no pattern to the crime, so there's no specific MO, no specific victim profile. And Chase examples this absolutely perfectly. So it turns out 2 days earlier, there was a woman in the local neighbourhood. She lived just a couple of blocks from Ambrose Griffin. She heard somebody shoot at her home. When the police went in to investigate, they actually found a bullet in her kitchen. And that bullet had been fired from a .22 caliber pistol, the same gun that had been used to kill Ambrose. So she had a very, very lucky escape. On the 11th of January 1978, this is less than 2 weeks after the shooting, Chase goes round to his neighbours, Dawn Larson, and he asks her for a cigarette. And at this point, he forcibly restrains her until she gives him the full pack. So what we're seeing in this moment, yes, he doesn't kill her, but the evidence of volatility, this violence, this malevolence within his nature, we're seeing this exhibited, repeated violence towards people. And it's also in public, by the way. So he's not seeing boundaries. He's not concerned with consequences. And that's really dangerous as a mindset. It's usually our moral or societal expectations of behaviour that hold us prisoner to act in certain ways, and for good reason, because we don't want to break those moral codes because there are terrible consequences when we do, rightly so. You go to prison, or people, I don't know, retaliate. But Richard Chase isn't showing this understanding. And another terrifying incident occurs. Again, this is 2 weeks after the shooting of Ambrose. Richard Chase attempts to break in to a random woman's home. Now, luckily for her, the house was secure, and it really is luckily for her. The unnerving thing is that the house owner, Jean Layton, she was actually there to witness the break-in. So she watched as this very disheveled, long-haired man approached and tried a front door. Then he tried the windows, and then he tried the back door. And at the back door, she literally came face to face with her potential intruder. And she looked at him directly through the glass. Apparently, he looked straight into her eyes. Then he lit a cigarette, and then he walked away. Imagine coming that close to evil. Because no matter what we're going to say about Richard Chase's mental illness, the actions that he carries out are evil. Now, what we learn later on about Richard Chase is that because her house was locked up, because he couldn't enter, he took this as a sign. As far as he was concerned, if a place was secure, he would walk away. Now, bear in mind, we've talked about this first murder, which is a random drive-by shooting. The second murder that he commits just weeks later was going to be a completely different scenario. When we think about escalations in offending types, this is something that is staggering. This is also the thing that earns him the moniker of Vampire of Sacramento. It's the 23rd of January 1978. Chase is presented with another opportunity because he finds a house that is unlocked. So, as I've said, if he found a house that was unlocked, he took that as an invitation, which is weird because anybody who does read books on vampires or watch movies on them, basically it's like you have to invite them into your home for them to actually be able to suck your blood. So to some degree, even he seems to be acting in a way that's in context with that kind of behaviour. He believes that there is a ritual to his offending regarding whether he's allowed to actually carry out the attack or whether he is disallowed based on whether he can walk in. So those unlocked doors depict whether you will live or die. And for Teresa Wallin, that door that day is unlocked. All she'd been doing was putting rubbish out. She just left the door unlocked because of that. Teresa was 3 months pregnant. She was alone in the house. She'd been expecting a baby boy. They'd planned to call him Dane, and she and her husband were so excited. They were thrilled at the prospect of becoming parents. Her husband, David, was out at work. He was a sales executive at a linen company, and it's hard to imagine for 1 minute that when he kissed his beautiful wife, the expectant mother of his child, goodbye that morning, it would be the last goodbye kiss. It's just too terrible to imagine how people reflect on those moments. The extraordinary ordinariness of a day that will never be repeated, but you would have never known in that moment. And how could she or he have realised the fate that she was going to be dealt that absolutely dreadful day? So he walks in, he uses a .22 caliber pistol and shoots her multiple times. One bullet went through her hand, one hit her in the neck, one hit her in the head and went through her top of the skull, killed her instantly. Then he knelt down and he put a final bullet in her temple, point blank range. But it's after he's murdered this poor woman that his true depravity is demonstrated. These twisted desires of his are allowed free rein. Now bear in mind, he's practiced this many, many times on small animals, but wow. Richard Chase is going to take it to a whole new level. He then drags her body into the bedroom and he proceeds to mutilate her and sexually assault her corpse. And whilst raping her body, he is repeatedly stabbing her with a butcher's knife. He stabbed and slashed at her torso. He punctured her lungs, her liver, her stomach, her breasts countless times. Again, with these kind of sexual predators, the dehumanizing of the female corpse is something that we see with disorganized killers. And he does this to her. Ultimately, he disembowels her. He removes her internal organs, tore her pancreas. He removed her intestines. He actually left her intestines spilling from her body. He also then cut off her left nipple. And using an empty yogurt pot, which he managed to find in the rubbish bag, he drank her blood. He also smeared it all over the walls. Finally, in another act of dehumanization without a doubt, he stuffed dog feces from the yard down her throat and in her mouth. And that's the state that Richard Chase left that young woman to be discovered by her loving husband. On that day, David had actually been delayed for hours because his car had broken down. So he arrived home after dark and he noted that the house was in darkness. He had the stereo playing. He also found the bag of rubbish. It was strewn all over the hallway. And then he noticed the dark stains on the carpet. He thought they were oil. So he followed them through to the bedroom. And that's where he found his wife's body in the doorway. And he said he just began hysterically screaming that he'd be forever haunted. He later stated, "I had no idea where I was or who or what I'd seen. It was just beyond all comprehension. All I know is the noise I was making. I was screaming and screaming so much that my neighbours raced over to help me." David called his parents. They actually arrived before the police. And it's such a human reaction, isn't it? In those moments where, even though you're an adult, your world is falling apart, you think about those who make you feel safe. And for David, that would have been his parents. And according to him, seeing Teresa's mutilated body destroyed his mother. One of the things that occurred that, again, just makes you sit up and think, how, is that David ended up having an altercation with Richard Chase's mother at the court. And where would you be as a mother in court where your son is accused of multiple homicides in which he has done some of the most depraved things that any of us could ever imagine? You would imagine a little bit of humility, wouldn't you? I don't know, don't go, sit at the back, cry a lot, be apologetic. Those are kind of things that I just throw in as possibilities. But no, she confronts David at court, the man who's lost his pregnant wife because of her son, and says to David, "Why didn't your dog protect you?" I mean, arguably it would be that Richard Chase had ate it probably, but anyway, by the by with my sarcasm, why didn't your dog protect you? I don't even know how she managed to utter those words, but he's unbelievably stunned and he just replied, "Why didn't you protect us, you sick individual? You raised that. And I don't know what she was expecting. I genuinely cannot wrap my head around what that woman was thinking, because if she had any understanding of reality, she would never have gone over to him and said that. Who could go over to a grieving widower and be like, basically, if you had a more aggressive dog, this would not have happened. It's your fault. Bear in mind as well that we're talking about individuals whose lives were absolutely destroyed because of Richard Chase. And it wasn't just David and his wife's life that was ended. Their little baby was never born because of his actions. Now again, Chase displayed very stereotypical characteristics of a disorganized killer when we think about how it played out regarding the murder of Teresa. So mutilation of the victim, sexual intercourse post-mortem. Remember, dysfunctional, disorganized serial killers are typically unable to have meaningful relationships with other people. They're often incapable of regular sex at all. Consenting partners certainly don't turn them on. They dehumanize corpses, and we've seen that, the mutilation with a knife, the dog feces down the throat. Very forensically poor as well, so the officers at the scene were able to find a footprint in the blood, and they were also pretty quickly able to establish that the same gun that had killed Ambrose Griffin had been used to kill Teresa, so they were able to link that crime. Also, just to note, a few days before he went ahead and killed Teresa, Chase had actually found another unlocked door. And this was of Robert and Barbara Edwards' family home. So they'd arrived home, they'd been shopping for grocery. They discovered Chase climbing out through a window. They saw him carrying an armful of their belongings. Robert Edwards basically chased him, but by the time he kind of tried to catch up with him, Chase had escaped over a fence. But what they discovered in their home was that Richard Chase had gone in, and aside from stealing items that belonged to them, he'd also defecated in the bed of their infant son, also urinated on his clothes and in a drawer. But again, it's just kind of showing the randomness and irrationality of this individual, along with some of his very odd behaviours. Just 2 days after he's carried out this heinous murder of Teresa Wallin, he then goes and buys 2 puppies from a neighbour. What was that neighbour thinking? Could I buy 2 puppies? Are you the Richard Chase that people say have a lot of domestic animals enter your building but never leave them? I mean, yeah, I am that Richard Chase. And you want to buy 2 of my puppies? Yeah, I want to buy 2 of your puppies. Will I ever see them again? It's highly unlikely. Okay, here you go. I hate it when animals get harmed. Don't get me wrong, we're talking about human beings dying as well, but life is life, and it's just tragic that this man had such a bloodlust for this kind of scenario. So he gets these 2 puppies from this neighbour, kills them, drinks the blood, and then he leaves their bodies on the front lawn of a property which is close to the Wallins' home. So to me, there's a level of manipulation there. There's a level of enjoyment. It's highly macabre, isn't it? To actually taunt, essentially, this family in this way. They may not have connected it, but he connected it. That was the message that he was giving. Now, Chase is on a roll at this point. It feels like the bloodlust that is acquired since he's carried out these murders is now ramping up. He's got a real obsession with killing. And it's likely also to do with the fact that he's having a psychotic episode that plays out with deadly consequences, which is very rare. The vast majority of psychotic episodes do not cause anyone to harm anybody else. It tends to be more likely they will harm themselves by a huge statistical amount, but not in this case. So the psychotic episode that's likely occurring for Richard Chase is going to have horrific societal ramifications. It's as simple as that. On the 27th of January 1978, this is just 4 days after Teresa Wallin's murder, Chase is going around the neighbourhood looking for these unlocked doors, and he discovers one. This is at the home belonging to a 38-year-old Evelyn Miroth. Inside, Evelyn had her 6-year-old son, Jason Miroth, also her 22-month-old nephew, David Ferreira. She was kindly babysitting for David Ferreira that day, and also in the home was Evelyn's friend and neighbour, 51-year-old Dan Meredith. Now at this point, Chase graduates to becoming a mass murderer. It's believed that Dan was the first person that he killed. He was watching the kids whilst Evelyn took a bath, and it's thought that it's likely he heard Chase enter the home and he went to investigate. So his body was found in the hallway. He'd been shot in the head at point blank range, so he didn't have a chance. He wouldn't have known what was happening. Now it's thought that 6-year-old Jason at this point hears the gunshot, runs upstairs to his mum's bedroom, and Chase follows him, executes him. It's the only way I can describe it. He shoots him twice in the head at point blank range. And he also shot that little 22-month-old boy, David, in the head as well. Now, Evelyn's body, well, hers was found in her bedroom. This is along with her son's body. It's basically believed that she was the last one who'd have been alive. She would have been in the bath. She'd have heard the gunshots. And you can't imagine a day that just seems so normal, just becoming so abnormal, and being able to hear what's going on but not quite understand what's playing out, just knowing something sinister and terrible is occurring. So she would have likely been the person that was the last victim. So after Chase has killed all the others, he enters the bathroom and then he shoots her in the head at point blank range. Then he drags her body into the bedroom, onto the bed. And the Vampire of Sacramento had left his trademark signature. Those who discovered her body found that she'd been partly cannibalised, and Chase had used knives from the kitchen. As with Teresa Wallin, he cut her stomach open, he'd removed several organs. Her intestines were protruding from the gaping wound, and he'd stabbed her again multiple times. And in particular, he stabbed her in the anus and the vagina, and he'd slashed the back of the neck. So again, this dehumanizing of the female organs, the sexual organs, so that internalized rage the psychiatrist talked about potentially playing out. He couldn't have normal, consensual, good sex with women, and he's angry. He can only enjoy it when he's harming them. He can only become erected and actually follow through and ejaculate when the person is dead and when he's dehumanizing and ripping this person to pieces. Also was noted that it attempted to remove one of her eyes, and a large quantity of her blood had also been removed. So they did suspect that Chase had stabbed her in very clear vital areas so that he could get a lot of blood collected in the abdomen, so that then when he sliced her open, he was able to drink her blood because there was so much of it, draining it and then drinking it. They found evidence of post-mortem sexual assault. Her body had been sodomized, and it's believed that he drank blood from the slashes on the back of her neck whilst at the same time anally raping her. When later down the line, they're able to establish that one of the features that was quite unusual is they were able to retrieve a large amount of semen that was discovered in her anus. So this meant that he took time. There were multiple ejaculations that led to this. And again, this demonstrates really poor forensic value to his crime, because clearly he's leaving DNA everywhere. And he's motivated by his own desires as opposed to the potential consequences. After he's finished, Chase steals Dan's wallet and steals the car keys, and then he leaves the scene in a red station wagon that was actually later found abandoned. It's a few blocks away. The engine was still running when they found it. It was just a few hundred yards, ironically, from Chase's house. So he almost drove himself home. Again, highly disorganized. You do not want to leave investigators directly to your door. Anyway, the fact is, we're at a point now where he's killed a large amount of people on one occasion. So as well as him being known as a serial killer, he does actually fit the definition of a mass murderer as well. When the police arrive on that grisly scene, and one can only imagine the nightmares that they had after seeing that scene in front of them, it must be absolutely traumatizing beyond belief. But it becomes obvious that there is an individual who's missing, and that's 22-month-old David Ferreira. Now, what transpires is that Chase had actually been disturbed by a knock at the door during his attack. So a 6-year-old friend of Jason's had come round for a play date. She'd then alerted neighbours that something wasn't right, and they had entered the house and discovered what can only be described as a scene of human carnage and destruction. Then they called the police. So as I've mentioned, David Ferreira, the 22-month-old, had actually been shot and killed at the scene of the crime. But what Chase had done was taken that little boy into the bath, cracked open his skull, and removed and consumed his brain matter. But he'd been disturbed, and at this point he'd fled using Dan's car that he'd stolen, and he'd taken David's body back to his own apartment. Here, he castrated him, and he used his genitals as a straw to suck and siphon blood from his body. He removed the child's internal organs, he blended them, and he consumed them. And David's corpse was only found months later in a car park behind a church. He'd basically been dumped in a cardboard box that was, again, not far from Chase's apartment. Now, similar to the scene at Teresa Wallen's, the murder scene that Chase had left was just carnage. Evelyn's home was literally a place that you could see an individual had essentially rampaged. It's clear that he was stressed, he was highly agitated when he committed the killings. Again, we expect this typically within a disorganized serial killer. And in the haste, he'd left loads of forensic evidence. So we had the bloody footprints, handprints throughout the house, the fact that he'd used the car to escape, he'd left it with the engine running. So that adds to the perpetrator's haste and clear agitation and state of mind, because he doesn't even turn the car off. And police at this point realise that it's likely they've got a serial killer on their hands. And what's difficult for them is they feel that it's just somebody who acts randomly. So it's an opportunistic criminal, and they are more difficult to predict. So FBI agents are brought in, and they're brought in to help with this murder investigation, and they create a suspect profile. This is based on the evidence that they've taken from the crime scenes. So this is what they profiled about this potential serial killer. They said it would be a white male, aged 25 to 27, thin, undernourished appearance, single, living alone in a location within 1 mile of abandoned station wagon owned by one of the victims. Residence will likely be very slovenly and unkempt, and the evidence of the crimes will be found at the residence. Suspect will have a history of mental illness and use of drugs. Suspect will be an unemployed loner who does not associate with either males or females, and will probably spend a great deal of time in his own residence. If he resides with anyone, it will be his parents. However, this is unlikely. Suspect will have no prior military history, will be a high school or college dropout, probably suffers from 1 or more forms of paranoid psychosis. In fairness, 10 out of 10, let's be honest, you couldn't have described him better. And they also concluded, worryingly, that he was going to kill again. But that's a very specific profile that they've drawn out and fits him perfectly. The witnesses that were spoken to, well, they couldn't really give a lot of information about the person who was a potential suspect, but some mentioned there was an individual wearing an orange Parker jacket, but no one was very detailed. Well, I say no one. What I should say is almost no one. Because there is this woman called Nancy Holder. She was a high school classmate of Chase's 10 years earlier, and she'd basically bumped into him on the same day that he'd broken into the Edwards home. Now, at the time, she hadn't recognised him. She thought he was a homeless man, to be honest. She felt like he was somebody who was on the streets, and she said his appearance from when she'd been at school to the person that she bumped into that day was so different and distinct that she genuinely just didn't connect that she knew him. But nonetheless, he looked agitated at the time. She said he looked like he needed a fix. And he approaches her and he said to her, "Were you on the motorcycle when Kurt was killed?" So Nancy, it turns out, had dated a young man called Kurt at school, and he had been killed in a motorcycle accident. So she was really shocked because she doesn't recognise this guy. She thinks he's a vagrant talking to her, and suddenly he's asking her these personal details that seems to suggest there was a thread of connection between them. But only when the man says, "It's me, Rick Chase," that she suddenly realises who it is. But Nancy felt that there was just something that wasn't right about him. I mean, arguably his appearance in itself, but there was just something about the way he acted towards her that day. And she noticed that he was wearing an orange Parker. Just going to put it out there as well. Again, not forensically the best thing to wear if you're carrying out murders, kind of a little bit on the recognisable side, but nonetheless helpful in this case for bringing somebody to justice. But that's what she sees, and she later heard it mentioned in a police description that there's been this murder suspect who's been wearing this orange Parker. She also said that on that occasion, she'd quickly left the store, but then he'd followed her to her car. He'd even begged her for a lift, and she felt very unnerved by it. She just quickly drove away. But after hearing about this murder suspect, she contacts the police and she says, I think I might know who the killer is. I think it's Richard Chase. So the police then check his background. First off, they establish he's got a .22 caliber pistol. It's registered in his name. Same type of weapon that was used in the killings. So the police immediately want to speak to Chase at his apartment. They'd actually planned to take him into custody at that moment in time, but he just doesn't come to the door. So the officers create a ruse where it looks like they've left, and then they just wait, and they wait, and they wait until he leaves his apartment, and at this point they apprehend him. And when the police apprehend him, shall we say that he has some incriminating evidence with him. So first of all, he's wearing the orange Parker jacket, but also they find that he's got possession of Dan Meredith's wallet. He's also carrying a box, and both of those are stained with blood. The box is filled with a blood-stained cloth. And Chase, let's be honest, when you think about the pen portrait of possibility that the FBI have painted regarding a profile, he matches it perfectly, as well as the fact that they've got eyewitness descriptions saying about this guy who looks unkempt wearing a bright orange Parker jacket. Police were already certain that they got the guy, but if they needed it any more convincing, which they didn't really, but let's just add to the weight of evidence. Once they got the warrant to search Chase's apartment, they were literally met with a house of horrors. It was definitely where the bogeyman lived. Place was filthy, and the smell was absolutely putrid. They found so much evidence in that place, to say the least. So several pet collars on the kitchen counter because he's murdering the local animals. They found dried blood on the walls and floors. They found kitchen utensils that were stained with dried human blood. They had animal and human remains in the fridge. This is including human brains in a Tupperware container. I know Tupperware keeps things fresh, but I do not believe that Tupperware would like this association with this particular thing being kept in it. And also they found other body parts that were wrapped in plastic and foil, and these turned out to be David Ferrara's, the little boy. They found parts of Teresa Wallin and Evelyn Miroth in the fridge, and they found the .22 caliber gun that was used in the murders. They also found the blender that was used to make smoothies from animal and human organs, had loads of coagulated blood and decaying matter in it, which is beyond comprehension. You know, what I'm talking about are people's organs in that place. These individuals who could never have seen it coming and were just going about their business. And we're talking about such a disparity in victim, aren't we? From the drive-by guy who was just taking the shopping in to now a 22-month-old child. It's beyond shocking. So Chase is arrested 5 days after the mass murder and is charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder. We get to the trial, it's January the 2nd, 1979, and Chase is escorted into the courtroom. He's got an entourage of 5 police officers, and that case had more than 100 witnesses who took the stand. The prosecution made it very clear from the get-go they wanted the death penalty. They felt that that was the only appropriate action that could be given to a case so serious. The defense, however, well, they said, listen, this guy is insane. The plea should be that he is not guilty by reason of insanity. They alternatively said that he was guilty of 1 second-degree murder on account of mental illness and lack of premeditation. And if that were the case, he would avoid the death sentence if he was only found guilty of that lesser charge. Ultimately, the judge said that Chase wasn't legally insane. That's what he ruled. On the 8th of May 1979, this is after a 4-month trial, so it'd been a long trial, the jury took just an hour to find Chase legally sane. They found him guilty on all 6 counts of first-degree murder. The jury then went to deliberate for a further 4 hours to decide if he should receive the death penalty. And Chase was indeed sentenced to death by the gas chamber. He's then transferred to San Quentin State Prison. Now, it's at this point that his delusions continue. And in a series of interviews with the FBI and an agent, Robert Ressler, Chase talks about Nazis, UFOs. In fact, they were Nazi UFOs. And he said that he wanted to capture them and have them convicted of his murders. He believed that they telepathically instructed him to kill, so they were responsible, not him. He also asked for a radar gun so he could apprehend them. I'm not going to lie, sounds like a great gun. I'd like a radar gun, particularly if it could apprehend UFOs. But this is delusional, isn't it? And he's also talking about the fact that he believes that the prison guards were working with the Nazis, that they're trying to kill him. On one occasion during the interview with Ressler, he actually carried with him in his pockets lots of macaroni cheese. And the reason for this is he believed that his food was being poisoned, but this is not the actions of a well-adjusted human who's coping, is it? I think I'm being poisoned. I could leave my food on this plate, or I could hide it in my pockets. Anyway, that's where his mindset is. The FBI agent also discussed with him the fact that this man had constantly talked about his need to consume blood. And Chase said, it's not my fault. I don't have any other option but to consume blood. If I do not consume blood, I die. So it's me or them. That was the way that he put it. And he was asked, well, tell me why you select your victims the way that you select them. So this is how we found out what his mindset was like leading up to the crimes. So this idea of the open door being an open invitation. And what he said was, if the door was locked, that means you're not welcome. Which is just horrifying, isn't it? Because how many of us leave our doors open? I'm certainly guilty of doing that at times. When you think about him being transferred to this prison where we are talking very high level offenders, the notoriety of him preceded his arrival. And because the murders that he carried out were so brutal, they were so unusual, remember, he's drinking blood, he's ingesting organs. His fellow inmates on death row were actually scared of him and they wanted him dead, which is ironic because he's on death row. So I think that was the aim of the game. But it shows you that even these big, tough guys, these gang members, these men who were stacked and strong, they were really unnerved by him. Bear in mind, we're talking about Chase at the point where he's an underweight, drug-addled wreck. But whilst any of those men could have essentially killed him if they'd got their hands on him, there was something about his nature and actions that made them not want to be involved with him that directly. So these prisoners are so terrified by his actions that they want him dead, but they're actually too scared to kill him themselves. I mean, even gang members feared him. It's bizarre because if you think about it, Chase was an underweight, drug-addled wreck. And I believe that part of the reasoning behind them not taking action against him was they weren't sure what he was. That his actions seemed so demonic that I don't know whether they believed they were dealing with him or the devil. And who wants to take on the devil? I mean, to be fair, quite a lot of them are probably visiting him personally, but you know where I'm going with that. It didn't sit right with them. But what the inmates do is they actively encourage Richard Chase to kill himself, and ultimately, they succeed. On the 26th of December 1980, prison found a then 30-year-old Richard Chase basically lying awkwardly on the bed, and he'd taken a fatal overdose of antidepressant medication and he'd been storing it for months. So whilst he was mentally unstable, he certainly knew what he needed to do to end his life. Without a doubt, Chase is truly typical of a disorganized serial killer. So as well as displaying the McDonald triad I outlined earlier on and other characteristics associated with violent offenders such as drug abuse, abusive parents, another thing that he displayed that is associated specifically with disorganized offenders is that he was a weird loner type. He was sexually incompetent, so girls that he dated said he was impotent, and he was only aroused by post-mortem mutilation and intercourse. He was a necrophiliac. he enjoyed the mutilation of a victim, and he acted in a spur of the moment way. So he's an opportunistic killer. And also the scenes of carnage left at the crime, so the blitz killing. And we have to add the fact that there was an added ingredient of serious mental illness, and that's another common trait of the disorganized offender. And Chase is used by the FBI as the perfect example of a disorganized serial killer when they're training FBI agents. I'm gonna say, this is no excuse, clearly Richard Chase is terrifying and nothing that he did is excusable. His victims were treated diabolically and lives were ruined. But you have to question the morality of his treatment by the criminal justice system. It is questionable. He failed in his defense of insanity. Now, to succeed in that defense, you have to show that his mental illness meant he didn't know what he was doing, or he didn't know what he was doing was wrong. At the time of the crimes, Chase was definitely suffering from psychosis, schizophrenia, and extreme paranoia. And it seems like during a psychotic episode, it is completely rational to suggest that he had no idea of what he was actually doing, because you can be completely detached from reality. Also, strong possibility he didn't believe that what he was doing was wrong. As far as he was concerned, as he stated to the FBI agent, I had no choice. It was either I replenish my blood supplies or I die. So he firmly believed that he needed to ingest blood to survive. So genuinely, do I believe that Chase satisfied the legal definition of insanity? Absolutely. So therefore, do I believe that he should have been sentenced to death? I don't feel that that would be appropriate. He should definitely never have walked the streets again, and he certainly should have been locked up. You know, he was a seriously mentally ill man. He needed to be put away for everyone's safety, and he needed to be treated. But I think the fact that the nation and the whole world actually had been so appalled by his crimes that people wanted justice, and that meant that he was always going to get the death sentence. Also, the fact that people suspected that he'd caused some of his mental illness wouldn't have helped. He'd used a lot of drugs, and therefore he contributed to that situation as an individual, so the sympathy for him wasn't high level. Whereas if somebody had a serious mental illness and it was just one of those things that had occurred within a brain disorder and they had no control over their actions, one could find sympathy. I don't think that people felt that with Richard Chase. As I've noted, this is not me defending him in any way, shape or form. It is indefensible. But I do think we have to acknowledge that he was very likely insane. But Chase was an utterly terrifying individual. Yeah, he was clearly very damaged. He had an abusive childhood, serious mental illness, serious drug and alcohol dependency, and obviously we see that he only was sexually satisfied when he was involved in very serious and disturbing acts of violence. But when you look at the first killing to how his last killings took place, it is shocking how those crimes escalated. You know, from years of harming animals, suddenly making that leap to hurting people. And we're talking, he went from drive-by to murder, mutilation, to mass murder and serial killing in the space of 1 month. And we have to be so thankful, really, to his old classmate, Nancy Holder, because Chase was not on the radar during that murder investigation. It was Nancy who brought him to the attention of the authorities. The FBI were without a doubt absolutely correct in the assumptions that they made about his profile, but if she hadn't gone and spoken to them and identified him, Chase would have killed again. And despite the forensic evidence at the scene, he would have been very difficult to catch and apprehend, because it would have been impossible to predict his next move, because there's no pattern to his crimes. They were random, they were opportunistic. Anyone could have been his next victim. His victims ranged in age alone from 22 months to the age of 51 years. Males, females, children. Really difficult to see that pattern. Really difficult to intercept those kind of killings because they are so random. It's hard to find a lesson where Richard Chase is concerned, but I guess what we could say is to remind ourselves that you should always make sure that your home security is effective. Lock the doors. close the windows. You don't want to make yourself vulnerable and available, because at the end of the day, while serial killers are incredibly rare, for those individuals that Richard Chase murdered, they became that statistic. Always lock your door. And what's really ironic is when you think about the fact that this man, the Vampire of Sacramento, genuinely sucked the blood of his victims, whilst vampires don't actually exist, for the individuals that he killed, they really did. I hope you found this case, well, I imagine alarming, but also I hope that you've heard things that you might not have heard before. I'd love to know your thoughts on whether you thought he was insane and whether he did deserve the death penalty or otherwise, even though he ended up taking his own life, or whether you think, well, you know what, Emma, yeah, he absolutely was insane, beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it's still something that deserved the death penalty. People are absolutely entitled to their own opinions. Give me a like, give me a comment, get your notifications on so you never miss me, subscribe if you like. As ever, a big thanks to all of you guys. You make such a difference coming here and viewing this, and I appreciate every single one of you. Take care, be safe, and also lock the doors. Lock the doors. Never invite a vampire into your home.